Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our morning briefing series. My name is Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Kaiser Forum. Today, we are looking at the technology and the politics of drones. Since Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine in 2022, we have seen an enormous development in the number and quality of drones used by both sides. Russian drone attacks have more than tripled since last year. And just yesterday, we heard about Moscow sending more than 400 drones and missiles targeting especially the city of Ternopil, and at least 25 people have been killed. Ukraine, too, has made progress on drone technology. And in 2026, next year, Kiev says they could produce up to 20 million drones if they get enough funding. But drone warfare isn't limited to that conflict. Following a range of drone incursions into Poland and other EU countries, European policymakers are looking for answers. The European Commission has set out to build an anti-drone system that is scheduled to be operational by the end of 2027, dubbed the drone wall. Now, perhaps this is a slightly misleading term because it's not supposed to be a physical barrier, but rather a coordinated network of drone trackers, jammers, radar and acoustic sensors, and other counter-drone measures. In addition to that, various European countries have reported suspicious drone activity at airports and power plants. Last year, German authorities reported a total of 118 incidents at German airports, and this year I think the figure is even higher, with 9 resulting in a complete closure of the airport. And just earlier this month, actually, Berlin's airport was briefly closed due to a drone sighting. Now, not all of these incidents can be attributed to foreign interference, but they reflect the magnitude of the problem and the need to come up with responses. So how are drones reshaping warfare? Who is driving innovation? And what are the effective political and legal instruments to control the defensive use of drones for our security in Europe? To discuss these and other questions, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. First up will be Dr. András Rácz, who is a senior fellow at DGAP's Center for Security and Defense. He's a co-founder of this morning briefing series and frequent contributor to all things military. András has, I think, spent more than 100 days in Ukraine since 2022 and will be able to report on what's going on in terms of drones on the battlefield. Next up will be Dr. Ulrike Franke, who's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, based in Paris. She's also the co-host of Sicherheitshalber, a leading German language podcast on security affairs. She holds a PhD from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Ulrike Franke. Last but not least, Dr. Emil Archambault is a British Academy Global Innovation Fellow based here at DGAP with the Center for Security and Defense, which was, by the way, relaunched earlier this week. He is also a postdoc fellow at Durham University, and he works on militarized drones and the implications of emerging technologies on security and defense. So welcome, Emil. Now, before we begin, as per usual, just a reminder that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And when invited to speak, briefly introduce yourself and keep your question or comment relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues supporting this series. And now, without much further ado, let me hand things over to you, András. If you could give us some of the latest developments in Ukraine in terms of drone activity.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us today morning. And when it comes to drone activities and the frontline situation, let me share a map with you to demonstrate the most severe or most tense point of the frontline, of course, Pokrovsk. So as usual, we are going to use the map of the Institute of the Study of War from this morning. Can you see the map? Good, thank you. So as you see, the color code red means territories firmly and confirmed controlled by the Russians. The code yellow means the territory claimed to be controlled by the Russians. Even if we take only the territory marked red, it demonstrates that the Battle of Pokrovsk will soon be over. This is a near complete envelopment. even though physically there are at least one big and one smaller road still leading to the city. All these roads, supply routes, are under firm fire control of Russian artillery and drones. This means bringing in supplies is extremely complicated. Similarly complicated is to evacuate the wounded. This will soon be over. The only question left is whether Ukraine evacuates or withdraws its forces from particularly Mirnohrad on time, or the same thing gets repeated, which happened already several times during this war, that Ukraine withdraws too late, too slow, so significant forces get encircled and subsequently captured. Here, the Battle for Pokrovsk demonstrates both the limitations of the use of drones in urban combat and also some new ways of using them. The Battle of Pokrovsk, particularly in the very city center, downtown, large, several stories high concrete buildings, it demonstrated that even fiber optic drones have their limitations while getting used in the city because of physical obstacles, because of limits on visibility. And Pokrovsk also demonstrated that bad weather, fog, rain, and humidity, these actually hamper the deployability of combat drones. Russians managed to bring in significant reinforcements into both Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk under the cover of deep fog. So right now, technologically, it seems to be that deep fog is still something that limits the use of aerial drones. Meanwhile, and in both sides, both Ukrainian and Russians are deploying their best drone teams in the Battle of Pokrovsk. From the Ukrainian side, the so-called Birds of Magyar, Robert Brovdy, so the Birds of Magyar are there. From the Russian side, the Rubicon regiment is represented there with more than 100 operatives at least. So both sides are putting into the battle the best what they have. The battle also demonstrated that when supply routes are under enemy fire control, meaning both FPV drones, so aerial drones, and artillery fire, ground drones play an increasing role in bringing in supplies, evacuating the wounded, sometimes also providing live fire support, so conducting also combat missions. Pokrovsk is basically a super intensive training ground and testing ground for the use of ground drones. Here, in terms of ground drones, Ukraine still has the innovation advantage. Russia does not yet have ground drones similarly developed like Ukrainians do. For example, Russians don't have mass-produced ground drones for evacuating the wounded. Meanwhile, in terms of you have some interference. Please mute your mic. Lovely, thank you. Meanwhile, in terms of aerial drones, Russians already managed to catch up. So in terms of innovation, the both sides are basically on the same level, while Russia clearly has the superiority in terms of numbers. If one speaks to Ukrainian drone operators, they keep telling that while they have 20-30 drones per day per operator, Russians can easily use / waste 40 or 50 of them. The same goes for cheaper FPVs, the same goes for more expensive fiber optic drones. So in terms of technology, both sides are on the same level, but Russians clearly have the numerical advantage. Last thing here, one reason for that is that Russia operates a much smaller number of types, but those types are mass-produced. Ukraine is operating more than 100 various types of aerial drones, which makes training, logistics, tactics, everything extremely complicated. Ukraine's drone arsenal is basically like a Christmas tree. Everything colorful is hanging upon it. On the Russian side, this is way more centralized. And the Rubicon unit on the Russian side is a very unique formation, originally an engineering and drone unit, which deploys engineers right to combat troops. So direct combat feedback is ensured. While on the other end, Rubicon is directly connected to Rostech, so Russia's main technological consortium, meaning that the information they bring in about the technological needs goes directly into the production lines. This is a very, very unique formation. There is a lot to learn from how the Rubicon regiment functions. So that's it from me for the start. Thank you again. Word back to you, Jan.
Thanks a lot, András. So thanks for giving us a glimpse of what's going on the front lines. And you already mentioned a whole number and range of types of drones. And I wonder, Ulrike, if you could help us give an overview of the kind of developments of drones over the past year or so. So a big picture, and perhaps also touch on some of the recent incidents in Europe that have made headline news, to give us an overview of where we are on drones.
Sure, I can do that. So what we've been seeing in recent months, let's say the last year or two, is two things really, and that was actually the first point I wanted to make in my initial remarks. We need to be clear as to what exactly we're talking about and what challenge we're trying to address. For example, with this drone wall. So what we are seeing at the moment in, let's say, Western Europe is an increase in the number of overflights of drones over critical infrastructure, disruption of airport operations, and similar. It's an increase in the numbers, although I think the numbers aren't the most relevant bit here. It's also a change in the kind of drones we're seeing. Now, to be very clear, we don't really have that much information as to which drones are being used, because so far these drones have not been intercepted. But just in terms of, what could be seen, there's video material, there were witnesses on the ground. We can see that there are now kind of larger drones, several drones that kind of circle over critical infrastructure for a long time, fixed wing rather than rotor drones. All of this points to operators that aren't just hobby drone pilots, although they could be. So we have this kind of situation where it seems that we have an increase in drone operations over our own national territories. And I'm quite comfortable saying this is part of a hybrid warfare campaign that we've been seeing for years coming from Russia. It is true that we can't pin every single incident onto Russian operators, and I'm sure there are incidents that have nothing to do with Russia, to be very clear. But again, in terms of what we are seeing and the types of drones we're seeing and how it kind of generally looks like, I think this is rather obvious. So this is one part of the situation. The other part of the situation is the question of the defense of the eastern flank, NATO's eastern flank, the border to Russia, to Belarus, to Ukraine. And there we, of course, had this important incident where 19, I've also heard 23, but anyway, 19 drones, Russian military drones, here there's no question as to who flew those and what they were, crossed into Polish national airspace and were then subsequently shut down or crashed. Now, in this whole context, we then had and have the debate on the drone wall. And something that worries me is that we seem to be putting everything together. So kind of my first point that I wanted to make is to be clear as to what challenge you're trying to address. Because right now, especially in the EU, and Ursula von der Leyen and others have made similar statements, it sounds as if the drone wall will do everything at the same time. So it's going to protect us against drone incursions from the eastern flank. It's going to protect our critical infrastructure. It's going to surveil our borders. It has become this kind of silver bullet to all our security questions. And I really worry that is wrong, because these are different challenges and you need to address them differently. So if we're talking about a drone wall, for me, this is the eastern flank defense. So this will be the defense against drones crossing over from Belarus, from Russia, from or through Ukraine. But it has nothing to do with drone sightings over Copenhagen airport. Why? Well, because these drones don't come from Russia. They may be piloted by Russian agents, but they're being started from inside the country or from sea. So any kind of drone wall on the eastern flank won't help against that. So I think this is incredibly important to mention. Similarly, I'm pretty certain we are going to see a rise in what I would call drone terrorism. So terrorist organization linked or not linked to Russia or similar actors, are likely to use drones for attacks, to scare people, to terrorize people. Here again, the drone wall on the eastern flank, that won't be the solution, and it would be unwise to suggest otherwise. I also think that the drone wall, and I think we're gonna talk about this in more detail. This will need to be a kind of layered defense coordinated by several actors, kind of bringing together several actors in kind of one command and control post or coordination post. But I also think that they will probably, this drone wall will probably need to be operated by national actors along the front line, because we're talking a very long eastern flank, and it seems unlikely we're going to have like one unified thing operated by one force, kind of extra force, NATO, EU. Otherwise, I think we need to be kind of make sure that we need to be ambitious, but not too ambitious and overpromise. And the last point I care quite deeply about is that, we're talking about drones for a good reason. I've been working on the topic for like 15 years. However, when we talk about defenses, we need to be careful not to overlook all the other possible ways of attacking us and disrupting our infrastructure by focusing only on drones. Drones are only one part of the challenge. And this is true when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure, of course, but this is especially true when we talk about the drone wall on the eastern flank. Because the worst thing we can do, basically, is create this great counter-drone system on the eastern flank with like layered detection systems, layered defenses, able to shoot down any kind of drones. And then Russia looks at this and sends missiles, rockets, manned aircraft. Balloons, you may have seen that in Lithuania we had several instances of balloons being used for smuggling and possibly sabotage or attack. So the kind of focus on the drone wall, as much as I appreciate this, it needs to be kind of defense of the eastern flank rather than a defense specifically against drones, because there are other risks here that we can't need to overlook. And I'm happy to kind of go into detail of more on this, but we wanted to keep it short for the introduction.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ulrike. And I'm sure we'll come back to the specifics of what you laid out about the drone wall on the eastern flank, mentioning that it will probably be split among member states and comprise a whole complicated range of systems. And I'll be curious to hear more about the feasibility of achieving that in the next few years in the Q&A later on. But for now, let's perhaps move on to some more technological developments, both regarding the kind of border security, but also the more domestic security and the infrastructure, and perhaps some expectations and risks for the upcoming year. Over to you, Emil.
Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. And I find myself in a bit of a similar position to Ulrike there, as being the so-called specialist or working on drones and spending a lot of my time thinking we should work not only on drones, but also we need to talk about other things that are not drones and how new developments in drone technology fit with that and how that can change the calculus. But I think the points I want to make today fit very well with what Ulrike just discussed, and also what András said, is that it is drones and drone activity is not something that we can separate from other parts of military activity or of a security architecture. It is not something where we can concentrate only on drones, but it is something that we have to think of in all aspects of economic activity, of security activity, of military activity as well. So we have seen some suggestion that, for instance, Russia recently, I believe, announced again that they would create a separate drone force. The question then becomes not only it might be an advantage in concentrating expertise, but whatever separate drone force you establish still needs to interact with the rest of the force. And I think that when we look at technological developments for the future, at what, for instance, the Bundeswehr is looking at, it is very much this question of how you integrate drone activities, drone defenses, and then the use of drones with other with other parts of the force. So in terms of development here in Germany, one of the main assets we have is that there is a very strong defense sector that is investing a lot in different types of drone technologies. So we have, that goes from the very large players, Saab Rheinmetall, for instance, but also many very young, and in some cases only a few years old, startups that work on new types of drones. And that again, and I echo entirely Ulrike's warning there, that drones is a very wide category, and I will try to go into as much detail into what type of drones we will I'm talking about here. So companies such as Helsing, which is in Bavaria, Stark Defense, which is another German startup, and Rheinmetall, which is one of the largest German defense manufacturer, are currently proposing models that are being tested by the Bundeswehr for loitering munitions. So these would be similar to the drones that Ulrike was mentioning that cross the border from Russia into Poland. So these are drones that are meant to attack drones that are meant to go one way, not to return, ideally. So these are one of the capacities that the Bundeswehr is trying to acquire, but it's not the only one. There is also, when we think back to the famous or the infamous drone debate that Germany had about large reconnaissance drones and potentially armed drones, these are much larger planes. We have not left those behind. This is still something that is very important in the force architecture for NATO and for the Bundeswehr. So their companies, well, Airbus, for instance, is developing a project for the Eurodrone, which is one of these large systems that is meant to come into operational service in around 2030. So basically, the question now is it's not an or question. Should the German military, should NATO militaries buy small drones or large reconnaissance drones or large armed drones or even large combat drones or collaborative combat aircraft that are meant to operate along with crewed fighter planes, for instance? It is very much an and question. How do you get capacities in what András was talking about, these small or fairly small drones? They're not all that small, but still in smaller drones that are for battlefield use, and also the medium and large reconnaissance drones, and potentially then looking further into the late 2030s, early 2040s, collaborative combat aircraft that are meant to perhaps acquire air superiority or engage in long-range strike. It is very much a wide spectrum of capacities that the Bundeswehr, that NATO militaries are looking at, and that we need to think about this whole spectrum. What that also means is that in terms of drone defense, as Ulrike said very well, there are separate questions of how you defend, for instance, the eastern flank of NATO and how you secure civilian critical infrastructure, airports, power plants, power networks, telecommunication networks, and so on. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And there we are looking at a large spectrum of capacities from electronic tracking, from electronic interception, from jamming to, at the end of the spectrum, interceptor drones or, small missiles or or small cannons that are able to intercept them or to shoot them down. But we need this whole spectrum of capacities or capabilities again. But it is also something where we need to integrate drone defenses into everything. It is a question of economic security. It is a question of being able to move small infantry troops on the battlefield. That cannot be done if you don't have coverage against drones. To large maneuvers, it is something that covers the whole range. So it is a big challenge because it is not something that the Bundeswehr has been doing for a long time. It is something where there are critical deficits, but it is something where they are now investing a lot in trying to acquire this capability. Now, the challenge is not different from acquiring other weapon systems in that you need to do it for this year, for as soon as possible. You need to be ready to have capabilities that you can scale and that you can adapt to for the near future, and also looking at the long-range future up to, yes, around 2040, 2045. So it is doing a lot of different things on different scales, in different ways at the same time. And it is a big challenge, but it is one that is necessary.
Emil, let me cut you off here. We'll come back to some of these issues in just a second. And I certainly also want to hear what you have to say about yesterday's news that the German government has submitted a law to allow the Bundeswehr more easily to cooperate with police force, state police force, in countering drone attacks, and whether you see the legal instruments fit for purpose. But I also see that the discussion has started in the chat, and so I want to allow, in case some people aren't reading the chat, I just wanted to allow Ulrike and András to respond to the question raised by Joe Mack, which is on the identification of drone activity. Now we're talking about drone activity over, say, an airport or a power plant or some other critical infrastructure. How can we tell? And can you walk us through the sort of technical bits of identification and countermeasures? How does this work, Ulrike?
Sure. So the question was, how can we tell if a drone or several drones over critical infrastructure are Russian in origin and not just a hobby drone pilot flying them? So the first thing I would need to say is that right now we can't tell with 100% certainty. I'm certain that several of those were done by Russia, and I explain why, but there is no 100% certainty. Why? Because we can't intercept these drones, which is our own fault. Honestly, at this point, over airports, this is a challenge that has been known for quite a while. We should have more systems in place, and we should have been able to intercept at least some of those, but we haven't. So what we don't have is the drone to analyze and kind of show, look, this is this and this system that clearly has been built by Russia or by someone else, and is sending signals to this position. So we don't have that. However, there are lots of kind of indicators that allow you to get a sense of who's flying these drones. And I put those in the chat. So there's a question as to, what drone are we seeing? And again, we're kind of seeing them, but you can already tell, is this a fixed wing drone? Is this a rotor, so a quadcopter drone? Fixed wing drones, much more likely to be flown by kind of competent actors rather than by hobbyists. Not certainly, but likely. Size of drones, fixed wing drones of like 3-4 meter wingspan, again, could be a hobbyist, rather unlikely to be a hobbyist. The number of drones, the moment you have several drones in the sky kind of circling over critical infrastructure, that's a pretty good sign that this isn't just someone who just wants to look at, what does the friendly neighbor airport look like? Flight patterns, if they're there for like hours and hours circling, especially when there are already kind of, police on the ground, again, another indicator, probably not a hobbyist, a drone pilot. So these are all things that can give you a sense. And I think András mentioned things like where does the drone send links to? These are things that you couldn't see from the ground, but you can detect from the ground if you have the technology. But just the last point, so there are all these indicators, and this is important, there is also intelligence knowledge that Russia and Russian agents are doing this. So, we have like Telegram discussions among certain actors basically saying, oh yeah, we are gonna use a drone and fly it over a Bundeswehr base to collect the data from Ukrainian mobile phones. Like this is kind of intelligence that we gather. We don't necessarily always kind of have the corresponding incident where this actually happened, but we have two things. We have incidents where we see something is happening that looks sketchy and looks very unlikely to be hobbyist drone pilots, and we have intelligence from Russia that this is something they are doing and entertaining doing. And so this together again leads me to say we clearly have these interferences as part of Russian hybrid warfare, even though it is, as of this moment, impossible to say this incident 100%.
Mm-hmm. I'll give you the floor in just a second, András. Let me throw in another question, because one of the problems seems to be the number of these incidents is steadily going up. And one of the reasons behind this, if I understand it correctly, is because the technology is becoming more available and it's becoming cheaper and it's becoming easier for malicious actors Russians or others to employ these things. So looking forward into the future, are we looking at even more increase? And what does this mean for countermeasures? Over to you, András.
Thank you. A few brief bullet points, basically to continue what Ulrike said. When it comes to observing and possibly intercepting the drones flying over our airports and critical infrastructure, right now we don't have any such technology that would be able to bring down a hostile drone in one piece, intact. So if you jam it, or if you shoot it down, comes the problem, where does it fall? I mean, in Ukraine, if there is a drone alert, there is air raid, people go to the basements, hopefully. So if something falls off the sky, the damage can be more or less mitigated. But when it comes in peacetime, let's say Copenhagen airport or random German airport, if you take a fixed-wing drone, 4-meter wingspan, if it falls off the sky, it can easily kill an entire family if it falls on a family house or on a car. So when it comes to interception, we really need to be careful about assessing what happens on the ground when we intercept the drones. This is also among the reasons why Romanian Air Force is very, very careful about not shooting the drones that violate Romanian airspace, because those drones fly over populated territories and those are fairly big. So that's point number one when it comes to interception. Second, in some cases, Ulrike made hints about intel information. Having intel on one thing is on an incident is one thing, but going open with a political attribution that yes, it is Moscow, it requires different level of knowledge and also different readiness for an open political confrontation. And the third thing, your question, Jan, about whether shall we expect more such incursions, definitely yes, because of two reasons. First, so far, whoever is behind those incidents, the perpetrator did not suffer any costs. For them, it's basically for free. We couldn't capture a single drone. We couldn't retaliate against the suspected perpetrators. So from their side, why would they stop? They do not risk anything. And at this point, it just makes no sense to stop. Second, a lot of technology has not yet been tried and tested against us. My biggest worry is actually fiber optic drones in the hands of terrorists. Why? Because all the drone countermeasures we have are worthless against fiber optics, including even VIP protection, including protecting our most important people, politicians, religious leaders, whomever. Jamming is useless against the fiber optic drones. Most of other countermeasures except physical barriers are also useless. And of course, the fiber optic cable has two ends. So once the drone lands, you can follow back the cable and actually track where it was operated from. Still, it's a major danger. And so far, whoever used these drones used them in a very polite way. Because the same drones could easily hit aircraft, fall on critical infrastructure. So far, no damage was inflicted. I mean, physical damage, only interruption of servicing. But from the side of the perpetrator, again, we didn't manage so far to impose any costs, literally any. So I just don't see why they would stop it.
Sorry about that. Thanks, András. Let's open up for questions and comments in the audience. Even though people have started posting in the chat, it's easier if you raise your hand and ask your questions in person. And meanwhile, as hands are shooting up, let me hand over to Emil once again, just briefly to comment on the new legislation proposed in Germany on the cooperation between Bundeswehr and police force. What are the basics of that, and do you think that's going to be effective, Emil?
Right. Yes, we need to see, of course, the details in not only how it works there's a legal level and then there's a practical level. But of course, we would expect that the Bundeswehr has capabilities that local police forces not necessarily all have. As you mentioned, Jan, we had an event here on Monday at the DGAP to relaunch the Center for Security and Defense, of which I have the good fortune, as does András, of being a part of. And we had Ralf Tiesler, who is in charge of catastrophe prevention and more or less civil security for the federal level. And what he mentioned is that one of the parts is that these defenses start at the communal level. It starts very much, you need to build this security from the ground up, from the smallest to the largest institutions. Now, when it comes to having advanced capabilities in drone defense, for instance, that is something that is very challenging because we cannot expect every local authority to be in charge of its own local area. So therefore, then being able to bring in expert capabilities from, for instance, the Bundeswehr is helpful. However, as András just mentioned, you treat drones on the battlefield differently as you would in a civil environment. You cannot start shooting things out of the sky automatically. And that was, of course, the reaction we saw from people such as Markus Söder after the first incidents at Munich airport. That works to a certain extent, but not always. In terms of detection, of course, that is the big challenge. If you can track a drone for longer, you might be able to see where it comes from and where it goes to. The incident that I always come back to is being Canadian was in 2024 at the Paris Olympics. The Canadian women's national football team used a drone to spy on opposing teams. How that was stopped was the French police found the operator. So, of course, someone has to be able to launch the drones and pick up the drones. Irrespective of where it is piloted from, someone has to be fairly close to be able to actually get the physical machine. Because as Ulrike mentioned, we haven't actually found the machine itself. That would give a lot of information. So it is hoped that the Bundeswehr would be able to complement the capabilities of local police authorities. However, the Bundeswehr will not solve everything. It will not. It is not a panacea. It is not a silver bullet that can take on defense of all critical infrastructure in Germany or in extension for NATO. Thanks. That needs to be built up in every police force as well.
Thanks, Emil. Is this a two-finger, Ulrike? And then I hand over to Ginger Pauli afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. No, just very quickly on this kind of new law. So the law basically allows, makes it easier for the Bundeswehr to help local law enforcement to track drones, ideally, first of all, track drones. So, and then there is a passage saying, okay, and in an extreme case of real danger to life and infrastructure, the Bundeswehr is allowed to intercept and even shoot down drones. As was mentioned, shooting it down kinetically is something that you try to avoid over civilian infrastructure. The thing is, I think this is a very good law. I think it closes a legal gap. For historical reasons, it's quite difficult for the Bundeswehr to intervene domestically. That's good. And it's also good that now they kind of found a way to allow this to change for these circumstances or in these circumstances. That being said, this is an extreme case scenario. The Bundeswehr actually kind of interfering here and shooting down a drone or intercepting a drone. This is an extreme case scenario. And just to kind of drive home this point, as I understand this law, it would not have changed anything if this law had already been in place with regard to past drone incidents. None of these drone incidents that we're talking about were presented kind of in an obvious way a danger to the life of the people, unless you say a drone near an airport is a threat and therefore it can be intercepted. But this is an extreme case scenario, so this is not enough, and I don't think the government claims it is enough. This is kind of one step, and what we need even more than this is local law enforcement being equipped and trained to intercept drones. Not every single police station, but quite a few, plus maybe kind of mobile teams. It's not going to be the Bundeswehr that does this, as Emil said. Also, by the way, because the Bundeswehr right now has a few other things to worry about, so maybe not the best moment to give it even more tasks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, that's interesting. So the legal precedent for what constitutes a risk of life to then make this law actually become effective. We'll have to come back to this with a group of lawyers perhaps in the future. But for now, let me hand over to Ginger Pauli and then afterwards Luke Johnson for their questions. Ginger, please.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all speakers for their very insightful statements so far. I have two quick questions, if I may. First of all, considering that the pace of innovation when it comes to drones in Ukraine is pretty high, in 2022, we were all still talking about Bayraktar, and now it's much more about small drones, fiber optic, whatnot. Do you see a risk that if the Bundeswehr or other European militaries would start procuring whatever is cutting edge now, in 2 years' time, they might be sitting on a stockpile of drones that is, if not completely obsolete, at least not cutting edge technology anymore? And if so, how do we deal with that? Second question, Dr. Rácz, I think you rightfully pointed out that whoever engaged in these drone incursions did not suffer any costs from it so far. So my question would be, how would deterrence by punishment against these kind of drone incursions look like? What could we do to impose costs on whoever the perpetrator is?
Great, thanks. So deterrence by punishment and the speed of development making drones outdated very quickly. András, would you like to start?
Thank you. I love speaking about deterrence by punishment. No, joking. There are, with a bit of simplification, there are two possible ways of deterrence by punishment: symmetric replies and asymmetric replies. Both need to follow the logic of basically any type of fighting. One needs to hit where it hurts. So diplomatic protest notes don't hurt. Condemnations don't hurt. For example, similar incursions into the adversary's territory over the adversary's critical infrastructure, for example, in regions which are very close to us, mentioning Kaliningrad, that could possibly have a deterrent effect. That's one way to go. That's the symmetric reply. For example, the Gerbera drones that flew to Poland, those Gerberas are really, really cheap devices. A month ago, I had the opportunity to photograph a few shot down Gerberas in the Kharkiv region. I'm happy to share the pictures. Those Gerbera drones are literally made of styrofoam and plywood. Gerbera drone costs $5,000 to $8,000 each. These are really, really primitive devices. There is nothing that prevents us, theoretically speaking, to copy them. And once 19 Gerberas fly into our airspace, then we should send back same 19 or versions of Gerberas to the adversaries. So that's a symmetric reply. And an asymmetric reply, again, hit where it hurts. The shadow fleet, what's remaining of the banking system, what's remaining of the energy infrastructure, energy trade, and all the points, the vulnerable points of the adversary, including also those financial assets of the adversary which are still under European control, the frozen assets. I would be very, very interested in having seeing more detailed plans about, let's say, using a sequenced nationalization of the adversary's assets. One more drone incursion, very good. We take an additional 100 million. Another drone incursion, good. We take an additional 500 million. And that's how you escalate. Again, the logic, hit where it hurts. Thank you.
Ulrike, did you want to come in on the speed of development as well?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for the question. One of my favorite topics, speed of innovation and how should we procure in light of the speed of innovation. So speed of innovation, especially on drones and counter-drone technology in Ukraine has been quite impressive. And indeed, there are systems we talked about at the beginning of the war, which now have become basically obsolete because there are countermeasures in place. And it really goes, kind of drone, counter-drone measure, the drone develops, the counter-drone measure develops, another drone comes along, etc., etc. And, fiber optic cable drones were already mentioned. This is a development I find fascinating. In this war, there are many things that happened. I kind of would have predicted, I did predict some things happen faster, some things happen more, that's all fine. Fiber optic drones, I did not have on my bingo card. Why? Because this is not, it's a technological innovation, but it's kind of a step backwards, right? Like this isn't going forward technologically speaking. This is kind of going back, putting a cable on a drone. What an absurd idea, but it works. And this is very much what the war in Ukraine also reminds us, right? This is all about what works. It's not about what's the next fancy technology. You only use the next fancy technology if it is better than the old one. And if something that's really old is better than what you have now, that's what you do. So yeah, fiber optic cable drones, fascinating. I don't quite think it's, the future of drone warfare for forever. There will be countermeasures to that as well, but still something that's worth mentioning. But how do we procure in light of this? Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There were some calls, let's say a year ago, Germany should buy 100,000 drones now and all of that. And already at the time I said, well, yes, we need to procure more, but more important than buying 100,000 drones now of a type that in a year's time may be somewhat obsolete or even indeed completely obsolete because there's a countermeasure. What we need is a new way of thinking about and doing procurement. So, and by the way, I think this is happening now. So what we basically need is a situation where we put the defense industry in a situation where they can research and they can develop kind of prototypes that they can develop and build certain systems that they then also give to you and you can test with those. But rather than kind of asking for 100,000 drones, you go for a smaller number and you tell the industry kind of keep working on those, keep updating those. And once the time comes, you need to be able to produce those at a large in a large number, right? And we give you the money to kind of put these production capabilities in place, but we don't necessarily ask you to produce right now because that could be the wrong system, but in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years' time, and to be able to kind of modify and implement feedback from the troops in the field rather quickly. That's a challenge both for the industry and for the state and the procurement agencies, because that's not how we did things in the past. But I think that's where we need to go. And to end on a kind of positive note, I think in Germany, the authorities are trying to do that. So the recent reports hasn't quite been confirmed yet, but the recent reports about plans to procure loitering ammunition in Germany kind of goes in that direction, where Germany has apparently asked kind of 3 companies to develop drones, even one company that's very new and one company that didn't really do this in the past. They don't have the proven track record, but they're clearly working on this. You have competition here in the field. They've been asked to produce a smaller number of drones and then deliver others later on. So it kind of goes in this direction of what I've been describing. And so I think we're kind of moving into the right direction here. Someone kindly posted, I think, the article on this that I wrote. If someone wants more detail on that, but yeah, there's definitely a challenge when it comes to procurement and how we did it in the past. But at least I can say that authorities are clearly kind of catching on to this and are trying to change this and very much learn from Ukraine and the way that they have a good feedback mechanism between forces on the ground, the industry, the procurement agencies, and you have very kind of quick innovation.
Although I saw a report in the Bild newspaper that these test results with the 3 companies you mentioned, I think, were insufficient in some of the early testing. So perhaps still some work to do, but that's probably the point that you're making. Luke Johnson.
Hi, my name is Luke Johnson. I'm a foreign affairs journalist based here in Berlin. My question is for Dr. Franke or the other panelists. I'm just back from Lithuania, where like the drone wall was a big topic of discussion, and they're still sort of behind the idea because they're on the eastern flank. How much of, when we talk about it, like the EU said that this system should be in place by 2027, which is like 2 years away, or 18 to 24 months away. When we talk about it, how much of it is envisaged like a system using existing technology and maybe integrating it better versus developing some new anti-drone defense?
Ulrike.
So, I mean, the honest answer is that at this point, we don't quite know the details as to, what the EU Commission, what other actors are really imagining, but I can tell you what I think should happen and what can happen. So I think the timeline is ambitious, but not impossible, because there are quite a few systems for drone detection and drone countermeasures. There's not one that is perfect in every context, meaning, topography, geography, things like that, or for every drone type. But what we will need is a kind of layered defense or layered detection. There are new ways of radar detection, basically. There are things like detection through sound. You have these different detection measures, which again, you can't put everywhere the same things. And, in Ukraine, we've seen that sound detection measures don't work as well in forests as elsewhere because, of the sounds you have there, things like that. But we will need a kind of layered drone detection. We will need layered drone defenses. And a lot of these systems do already exist and can be bought or modified. There will also be kind of more work and more innovation on that because of the speed of innovation that we mentioned earlier, and especially in Europe. I mean, right now there's so much momentum in the market. I seem to be talking to a kind of drone or counter drone startup every other week. So there's clear momentum in that. I think here, what the most important thing in my view that the EU, if it is the EU, can do now is to make sure that all the different things that are already happening right now in these countries, especially, on the eastern flank, they're already doing stuff. They already have things in place. They're already doing stuff. That all of these things are known, are coordinated, are interoperable to the extent that you can already ensure this, because I think we will end up with a kind of drone wall, if you want to call it that, operated by the national militaries in their countries. But what is important is that they should communicate with each other. For the intelligence picture, so that that if 19 drones are crossing over in Poland, are there also 20 crossing over in Lithuania? That's an important thing to know. And also to exchange best practices and things like that. And so I think what we really need now is kind of hit the ground running on making sure that there is a kind of organization, institution, I don't know how you call it, where countries say, this is what we're doing, these are the systems that we're using, this is how we can connect them, and this is then, I think, how we build a drone wall. And eventually we may have kind of newly developed European, I hope, systems in place as well. But you can already do a lot with the existing systems that are out there.
András, a two-finger, and then I'll hand over for the next question to Peter Linke afterwards.
Thank you. The good news is that we already have such an institution in place that could be used for counter-drone defense. This is the NATO integrated air defense system, the NATINADS. And integration is already ongoing. So what Dr. Franke said, it's important for the readers. The system is already in place. The only thing we need to include are the new counter-drone detection and interception solutions. So we don't start from scratch on. Actually, when it comes to the end of 2027 deadline, I'm fairly optimistic that parts of the system will be operational a lot before that, a lot earlier. So it's not that we are absolutely incapable. A lot of things are going on. To give you one more thing, the integration of the NATINADS or coordination of the NATINADS with Ukraine's Delta system is already ongoing. Because let's say when it comes to possibly shooting, intercepting targets in Ukrainian airspace, this would require that the two air defenses coordinate very closely. Otherwise, if we shoot onto Ukrainian airspace, that may complicate the work of the Ukrainian air defense. There is a lot going on, but this is not to be discussed in a public discussion. Thank you.
Peter Linke.
Thank you very much. Just a question for all panelists. In your opinion and with your insights, are drones a possible field for cooperation between European and Japanese arms manufacturers?
I see a few question marks on the panelists' faces, but perhaps Emil, let's have you go first.
Right. Well, my question back to Peter is: are you thinking of a specific system or specific type of drones, or is there any specific area you're looking at?
I'm just referring to what's going on in Japan at the moment, developing this kind of technology, where the same things are going on in South Korea. And after Wadenfuß and other European politicians' visits to Japan, recent Japan, and this talk about intensifying cooperation also in the field of military technology. It simply seems to be a question one should ask, whether there is such a possibility in technological terms, or whether there are too much problems to cope with just doing this kind of cooperation with Japan.
Right.
Emil.
I'll be honest, I don't have any insight into current work between Japan and German companies on this. Perhaps my colleagues do, but I think that we see that there is a lot of partnerships going in a lot of different directions in this, in the development of military technologies, and a lot of new partnerships being built as well. And Japan is part of that in cooperating with European companies in some respects. For instance, the obvious one and the most high-profile one is the Global Combat Air Program, which is to develop a fighter or a combat airplane, and that is between Mitsubishi for Japan and then BAE Systems for the UK and Leonardo for Italy. So there are, and it is certainly something where it is possible to have cooperation. Japan is cooperating already with several members of NATO, the United States above all, but also others. And of course, there is a strong will to have these systems be interoperable. So it is certainly something to watch and not something to exclude. Now, the question also is, of course, that the kind of systems that Japan might be interested in buying or in acquiring, the kind of capabilities they're interested in acquiring in a view to perhaps Chinese threats and so on, might be different from what Germany is looking at the moment, for instance, to control use on the eastern flank of NATO. So then it's a question of where you can sort of build on asymmetric capabilities on perhaps Japan having technological developments that Germany and other European partners don't have, and how that can benefit everyone. Two very quick points, just to come back to the discussion before as well. I agree entirely with my colleagues, with Ulrike and András, on the need to not remain static. Right, the idea of a drone wall there, it gives the false impression perhaps that it is a thing, and that once you've built the thing, it is there and you are secure. That is not how drone defenses work. Because as both András and Ulrike mentioned, this is a process of constant adaptation, right? So it is not a question of building the wall and then doing basic maintenance on the wall. It is something that needs to be, it is a layered group of defenses that need to be updated constantly. It is something that is something that you update over the next years, because we talk a lot about innovation in drone technology. That also means, and in drone tactics, that also means that we need to have innovations in defenses against them. We cannot remain static. Security is something that you have to build over time. And that comes also to the capabilities of the Bundeswehr. I think Ulrike is entirely right there. You do not want to build a stockpile and then just dust off the stockpile, but you need to continue building capabilities. That is something that you need to do now and that you need to continue doing for the future. You need to train with these. You need to develop operational concepts so that when it comes a time to surge production and procure these large masses of drones that you might need now, that you know how to use them and how to what to do with them and what the potentials are.
Thanks, Emil. We have to come to an end because we only have about 3 minutes left, and I'll give each of you 1 minute to wrap up. There are a lot of issues that we haven't even touched on. There's another question about Turkey and non-EU actors in the chat. We haven't really talked about partially and fully autonomous drones at all and the dangers associated with them. So there's a lot left out there for at least another morning briefing. But if I could ask you, as a way of wrapping up, just to give us a sort of best case or worst case scenario where things could go from here within the next year or so. So feel free to pick up questions that are still left out there and keep it to 60-second max. Let's go in the order that we started. András, Ulrike, and Emil. You're muted, András. If you could just...
Thank you. To the question of Ogujan Al-Bayrak, yes, there is indeed a potential in closer cooperation with Turkish defense industry, mostly NATO framework, because NATO framework ensures that Turkish production, defense industry production are interoperable with the European systems. Give you one example. Hungary is already using Turkish-made armored personnel carriers. I'm going to crucify Turkish language, sorry for my pronunciation. The Nural Makinas, Ejderi Alcin APCs are used by the Hungarian armed forces. Other European countries consider the Bayraktar, also the two-engine version, the Akinci, because even though Bayraktars are not good for battle environment when there is strong air defense, for long-range reconnaissance, for naval operations, Bayraktars are still good, and the Akincis will be a lot better. So yes, there is plenty of potential. Turkey needs to compete on the European markets like every other European countries do. Interoperability is ensured by NATO frameworks. Thank you.
Ulrike, your chance for a few final words.
Yeah, I'll use the 60 seconds just to give a brief overview because, you know, there was a question about Japan and now Turkey. So historically, there were two countries that were really the leaders in drone technology, and that was the US and Israel, and both of them still play an important role. Then for mainly reasons that the US didn't want to export their drone capabilities, Turkey and China became really important actors. And now, of course, the most relevant drone operator, I want to say, in the world is Ukraine. So these are the countries that you want to work with. I mean, what I meant, China probably not, but these are the countries that are very good at this, and you may want to work with. You could also, by the way, throw Russia, of course, in that, but you know we're not going to work with Russia. But these are the kind of leaders on in the field. Japan, as far as I know, is not part of that. However, and this is important, and this is kind of the case of Turkey and of China, drone technology is not, I mean, it's sophisticated technology, but I always joke, it's not rocket science, right? So it's a country that has, you know, a kind of good, educated engineer force and is willing to put some money behind this, can become a very important actor in the drone space. And again, I think Turkey is the prime example for this. So which leads me, final sentence, to the question of, you know, kind of, okay, so there's some countries we may want to cooperate with, or indeed we may want to learn from, but also drone and counter-drone technology is something that countries can do by themselves. So I'm just not entirely certain whether, you know, kind of looking for international partners is necessarily needed on this in the same way that it is needed, for example, kind of big fighter jet programs.
Emil.
Right, thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up one point from the chat that was from Helmut Gansler, that one of the interesting things to see would be how this would change, for instance, the potential for maneuver and for battlefield operations. And that is something that András spoke to very well. But I think one note of skepticism there was that it would be I would be very careful about proclaiming the death of maneuver battle or anything like that, because these things tend to come back. But what it shows is that you cannot think of armored warfare or of infantry warfare or of combined operations without thinking about drones, about how you're going to use them, how you're going to integrate them, and also how you're going to defend against them. And that is something that we see, developments we see in this area in other in many programs. For instance, one of the main sort of tank development program between France and Germany at this moment, the MGCS, the main ground combat system, drone defense is one of the pillars there. Now the challenge is that this is supposed to come into production in 2045. What will drone defense look like in 2045 is, well, if I had that crystal ball, I would be a rich man. So it is something where we need to think about how the Bundeswehr, how other NATO militaries need to think about every aspect of operations. Everything you do needs to have a drone use and a drone defense component, because it is unavoidable. That does not mean that everything has to be about drones, but drones have to be part of the questions, part of the answer, and it is a process of constantly training, of constantly integrating that as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Emil. Thank you, Ulrike and András. This was really interesting and helpful. We'll be back with more on this in the future, I'm sure. And the next morning briefing will already be on Monday, special morning briefing on the results of COP in Brazil with my colleagues. And then I'm sure we'll come back to the issue of drones in the future as well. So for now, we have to close. Thanks a lot for joining us today, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.